Hello and good morning everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar today. So we are joined here by Ronnie Altit from Incentra, who will be discussing the considerations in moving email archives to Microsoft Office 365.
Fantastic. All right. Good to see we could get the technology working. Good morning again, everybody. Thanks very much for taking the time. I'm going to try to get through the slideware as soon as possible so that we can leave as much time as we can for questions. And if there happen to be no questions, which would surprise me with this content, there usually is, then I can give you something that I wish someone once gave me a little bit more of, which would be time back in my day. So if we finish early, then that will give you a bit of time back in your day. Speaking of time, for those of you who are slide counters, we've got 13 of my slides here to present. You've already seen one of them, so there's only 12 to go. My intention this morning is to deliver this information to you and to provide you with some things that you could potentially action immediately after this call, and certainly, if not, things that you could be thinking about as you go through the, your thought process in moving your archives to Office 365. You notice there are three logos at the bottom of this presentation, Company 85 and Incentra. As far as you're concerned, please see this as your direct relationship with Bytes. We're just the guys in the background that work together with Bytes to deliver these archive migrations to you. So let's get into the second slide. This is what I'm going to cover. I'm going to give you a little bit of background on Incentra and our experience in this space. So that's really just to build some credibility for you, so that it gives you an idea that we're coming from a position of significant experience in this market, and accordingly want to share some of this knowledge with you as you embark on the journey to move your archives into the cloud. I'll then go through, what I'm going to start with is what's usually the first debate, which is, do I do this with an automated tool set or do I do this in manual mode? Now on those two slides you're going to see an awful lot of content. They're going to be busy slides, and as time goes on the slides will get lighter in content. Please, as I get to these slides on manual versus automated, don't get lost in the content. Have a listen to what I'm saying, because I'm going to cover all of the major points, and the slides will be available to you, as will the webinar, in a recording later on, so you can always come back and have a look at some of that detail. There just is a lot to cover there, and in fact I've abbreviated what I could there as it was. Then we're going to go through top 10 key considerations that you need to think about when moving to Office 365. We'll talk about factors that affect speed of migration. We always get asked about how long it's going to take. Then we'll spend a bit of time talking about how do you make the right tool selection, and we'll open up for questions. All right, so let's get into a little bit about the experience. So here's some pretty pictures with lots of things that should jump out at you. We've now migrated or completed almost 100 different archive migrations from and to many and very different sources, with Office 365 now becoming the primary target. We are still seeing a lot of demand out there for migrations to Mimecast and migrations to ev.cloud. So some of these considerations that we'll discuss today are very Office 365 focused, and some of them, which I think you'll be able to pick up on yourselves, can be applied and should be things that you should be thinking about, no matter whether your target is going to be 365 or a third-party archive like a Mimecast, ev.cloud, Proofpoint. If that's your target, then a lot of these will apply. So, as I was saying, a majority of what we're seeing now are indeed migrations to the online archive in Office 365, with a lot of organisations having E3 and archive effectively being provided at no cost. In those projects, we've moved nearly a petabyte of data, and that translates to something in the vicinity of 5 billion messages. In the Asia-Pacific region, we're arguably the only organisation who's got significant experience in doing these migrations, and we do these migrations all over the world with staff based in the UK, and together with our relationship with Company 85, that's how we ensure that we get outstanding project delivery in the UK. And we have definitely delivered projects in the UK. As I said, we have a dedicated archive migration expert based in the UK who works with our team here at the Centre of Excellence in Australia. So let me move on to the discussion about manual versus automated. As I mentioned, busy slide, and there's two of them. The key things are those that are on the left. We are often presented with discussions with customers who really don't know whether an automated tool is going to be suitable, and often don't know, typically an archive migration isn't a budgeted project. That's what we see all too often. People certainly budget moving to Office 365 as a primary mailbox, but forget that there's an archive to do, and sometimes don't recognize the complexity that comes with moving an email archive, and accordingly they tend to think that they'll just go manual and don't budget. So once pricing comes into the game and it's out of budget expense, then it really becomes a discussion about what's the benefits of manual versus automated. So what we've tried to do here in these two slides is to give you an indication of the key reasons and the key differences between manual and automated. So from a compliance perspective, chain of custody. You'll hear me talk about chain of custody later on in the presentation as well. Just for the purpose of ensuring everybody's on the same page, let me just define chain of custody for you in loose terms. It's the ability to prove that a stored item of data, when it's been transmitted from point A to point B, hasn't changed. And you have to be able to empirically prove that, potentially, for example, by hash checking the first object on site A and then hash checking on site B and comparing the hashes. That's what some of the automated migration tool sets will do. So when you're doing it in a manual perspective, whether you're coming out of Source 1, Email Extender, Enterprise Vault, EAS, doesn't really matter what the source archive is, they usually make it very difficult for you to get an audit trail. And also, once you're exporting data in that way, from a manual perspective, typically what you find is users can potentially have access to that data depending on which way you go. From an infrastructure perspective, when you're doing a manual migration, you're putting a lot of strain on your archive platform, and generally your archive platform potentially is still archiving as you're trying to do extractions. So when you use the automated approach, you can throttle things, you can control that access, and you can ensure that, and those tool sets access the data very differently, so often don't have any impact or very negligible impact on your existing archive environment. This one about project timelines. I can guarantee you that if you're in an environment of, say, 500 or more archives, I all but guarantee you that you will be at least half the speed of an automated approach. I had a client here in Australia who was looking to migrate 750 users and 3 terabytes of data. And they decided that they were going to go manual for the reasons I mentioned before, an unbudgeted project. Let's do this manually. 9 months later, the client rang me and said, Ronnie, can you guys come in and do the balance of our environment? I said, sure. What happened with your first one? And I quote you, he said, my staff are still in therapy. 750 users took them 7 months to extract manually. And he said to me, just because I'm a sucker for punishment, can you give me an idea of how long it might have taken you? And I said, we probably would have been in and out from once we started migrating, probably a few weeks, maybe a couple of weeks. And he said, don't even talk to me. So if you have some project timeline requirements, and the automated approach is always going to be significantly faster. Manual approach with data, you tend to get some issues with the data. Any archive will have some degree of corruption. That's a fact. Typically, the real key is that when you hit those corrupt items, or when the extraction process that you do hits some of this troublesome data, the process typically stops and doesn't really tell you what it was doing and where it got up to and why it stopped. So you have to kind of cross your fingers and hope that it's not going to happen if you rerun the process. So that can be quite painful and troublesome, and part of the reason why it takes a long time manually. From a resourcing perspective, if you're going to do a manual migration, I would recommend to you that you either put an employee on there that you don't want to be part of your business for long, or you go and hire somebody externally to do this as a contract role, because it is an absolutely mundane task to sit there and manually extract, and it's also incredibly frustrating given the issues that can occur. So moving on to the second slide with the differences between manual and automated. If you need to provide regular reporting back to your business, if you're doing a sizable migration and you need to be able to provide statistics as to who you've done and what you've done and how far away it is, then that's an absolute reason why you would use an automated tool. Very difficult to do reporting. It largely would be very minimal, and you've cobbling together reports. The shortcuts and the stubs, that becomes a very interesting one. When you've got shortcuts, for example, in folders, doing manual extraction isn't necessarily going to keep the data at the same location as the stub. When you do an automated, you then get the ability to manipulate those shortcuts and ensure that they get expanded and put in the right folders and then obviously in the right target. User experience. If you are concerned about the user experience, and you may think that that's a funny statement, and I would have thought it was funny too until I had a client who said to us they really didn't care what the impact of their migration was on the end user. They just needed to get out of their source archive and into their target. I said, really? You don't want us to ensure that they have the same user experience, that all their messages are in the same folder, that when they come in the next day it looks and feels exactly like it did the day before, it's just in a different spot? They said, no, we don't care, just get it there. So that's why I say, if you concern yourself with user experience, you'll find that the manual approach can be quite troublesome insofar as the difference between the time when you've done your extraction to the time that it gets ingested and then no longer archiving during that point. It becomes quite a period of unrest, as opposed to an automated migration, which can be a totally seamless user experience because the migration's happening in the background. The users typically don't even know what's going on. When you do a manual extraction, you are taking a two-step process. So you are manually extracting to PST, and some organizations think that it's not a bad idea to manually, to take the messages and push them back into Exchange. Interestingly enough, you'll have that process there, which does bring issues, and if you'd like to know more about them, please ask a question on that later. There are certainly issues with pushing stuff back to Exchange first, but then the interesting thing is that it actually takes longer to migrate primary mailbox data than it does archive data today. Some of the archive migration tool sets have built some very advanced features into them that allow them to bypass some of the throttling requirements or throttling limits, or leverage different clever ways to get data up to 365 in a much faster way than what has been done in the primary mailbox. So you actually potentially could slow yourself down if you take a rehydration approach. And as I say, there are other technical reasons that if you'd like to know, please somebody do feel free to ask that question. As it relates to the option of extracting to PST, obviously you then run into the issues of having the PSTs itself. So when you have significantly large mailboxes, and we have seen mailboxes that have been 200 or 300 gig in size, then obviously extraction to PST and having that sort of size PST means you've got to break down the PST, you then need to manage all of them. You can start to see some of the nightmares of this poor resource that you either hate or want to, that you want to leave the business or that you want to hire, would have to go through. And then on top of that, what you'll find is once you've done the extraction, you then need to manage the ingestion. And of course, that's fraught with potential danger as well from a risk perspective. It's a totally manual process. What happens if somebody extracts an archive to a PST and then presents that PST to the wrong user at the other end? In an automated scenario, that doesn't happen. Everything's fully matched and everything goes from the right place to the right place. And then you can see that there are another few issues down the bottom there, largely driven around time. So in summary, and I did want to spend quite a bit of time on those two slides, in summary, what I'd like you to take away from the manual versus automated is that speed is going to be a significant impact, particularly if you're at scale. There are certain size organizations, 200-300 users, you know what, it may make sense for you to go manual. It might become more cost effective and it may just be a better way to go. Certainly 500 seats and above, you have to seriously consider automated. And if you're over 1,000 seats, I think it would almost be nuts to try a manual-based approach. So that's a summary around that. So let's assume now we've decided that we want to take an automated approach. What are the things that we need to consider specifically as we go through into Office 365? The way you must start with a primary consideration of what are the business drivers and the outcomes that you're looking to have. So what do I mean by that? Some specifics. What's the user experience that you're looking to achieve? Is it the same sort of user experience or is it a different user experience? To my point before, do they need to have folder structure? Sometimes we have organizations who currently have user archives and they'd like to move them to 365, but not in a place that their users can access anymore. They just want them there to be able to do e-discovery on them. So sometimes there is going to be a user experience difference like that. Other type of business drivers and outcomes. Are there legal and compliance requirements? Do you work in an environment, for example, that has some type of SOX data retention requirements? If that's the case, then chain of custody is going to be important for you, and making sure that you do that. Is your project driven by a data center move? Is your project driven by your storage coming to end of life? You really need to understand the answers to those questions in terms of what is the compelling event that's driving you to move to Office 365, because that's going to help you with the second question around what do you actually need to move. So if you, for example, answered in question 1 that you are driven by legal and compliance requirements and you absolutely need to have, then on that basis, by extension, you would need to move everything, because legal and compliance would arguably expect you to keep everything. However, do they need you to keep everything for all of the users? Do you actually have to migrate data for users that are no longer employees of the company? So do you have a journal? Do you have to move the journal? If you've had the journal since day 1, then it's arguable you don't need to migrate your departed users, for example. Do you want to do a filtered migration where perhaps you only want to migrate a certain number of years or months into the personal archive there? You know, what are your reg compliance issues come into that whole what do you need to move? So starting from the business drivers and the outcomes will position you well as you go through the other considerations. So one of the big considerations, if you've decided to do this, is the order that you choose to do this. And the easiest way to summarize this for you is the real key is whether you can provision a personal archive ahead of the primary mailbox being migrated. So can you have that personal archive available? And typically that scenario is when you're in a hybrid configuration mode. So if you can make the provision of the personal archive, it is always recommended by us that you migrate the archive ahead of the primary mailbox. Doing so will deliver you the best user experience. You'll have the archive data there and ready for the users when their primary mailbox is moved. Very simple change. In fact, if we can get the archive up before you even start the live mail migration, the users can have that personal archive provision to their Outlook and they can immediately see it, and so when you move the primary mailbox folder there's no change for them from the archive. So that's how you can minimize user impact in a really lovely way. Of course, if you exchange 2007 and below, that becomes less of an option, so sometimes you may use third-party products. If third-party products are providing you that coexistence and that ability to provision the archive, that's a fantastic outcome. If they don't give you that capability, your migration approach will be less it will probably be a little bit more impactful to your users from a user experience than it would be if you could provision earlier. So a very significant consideration there, and be very wary because a lot of organisations that have a prowess and capability in migrating primary live mailboxes to Office 365 don't have the skill and the experience in the archive side to necessarily provide you the appropriate guidance and counsel. So please take considerable note of that point as you're having discussions on doing your primary mailbox. Really take a lot of time to think about which way can you do it to minimize user experience. If you can provision the online archive ahead of time, you'll be able to do that. So consideration number 4, chain of custody. Is that required? It's a very, very important item if you are in one of those litigious environments or you are subject to regulatory requirements around how you control data. And what we would recommend there is that the IT department often doesn't know the answer to this question. This starts to become a discussion with legal or risk and compliance within the organisation. So as you're preparing for your archive migration, it's always good to go and talk to the legal and understand what you actually need to keep. Because if you don't need to keep as much, let's see if we can reduce the volume of data we're migrating and therefore reduce the cost of the project. And if you know that you need to keep everything and you need to do it in a manner where you're protecting chain of custody, it's very important that that's communicated clearly with the organisation that's going to help you do this lift and shift. Archive policy management. So this is an interesting one. If you're running in hybrid mode with the primary mailbox on presence and the online archive provisioned in 365, it's important that archiving for your primary mailbox is disabled. If not, there's a risk that an email will be archived locally and then that shortcut gets moved to 365, and then you're going to get into all sorts of user support issues once you've got that stuff moved there. So very, very important that you consider that when you're doing your migrations. Internet bandwidth. So of course we're migrating from on-premise into the cloud. Bandwidth is obviously going to be a key consideration. That in itself is a pretty obvious statement, and I don't think that's going to tell you anything you didn't already know. Let me just give you some more color around that, however. So if you're going to migrate at Microsoft's reported average speed of 15 gigabytes an hour, that's going to require a minimum bandwidth of 50 megabit, right? Once you introduce latency, you've got to be very conscious of that, because migrations can tend to be quite chatty processes, and so links with high latency can result in very poor migration performance. If latency is an issue, there are some changes that can be made, by the way, to reduce the impact. And that's what we'd sort of like to talk to you about here. So Microsoft started talking about a concept called ship to disk, whereby you do an extraction to PST and you ship those PSTs to Microsoft. Basically, that definitely has some very, very good use cases. Generally, however, if you're going to do that, you're going to generally pick a tool to do your extraction to PST. So if you've already procured the tool and the services to extract your data to PST so that you can ship it to disk, it would stand to reason that the only reason you would want to use ship to disk is if it was going to be faster than if you could do it yourself by going direct from your source archive to 365. So let me just run you through that again. You've got a tool, the tool can go direct to 365. To use ship to disk, you need to extract your data already that you're going to have the tool for. The only reason you wouldn't go direct to 365 is if it was going to be faster to come to disk, ship to disk, and then import that way. Other than that, you may as well go directly in. However, there are some times where we could also look to take the archive. If the archive can be, a copy could be taken, we could move that archive closer to the 365 tenant location, maybe into an Azure instance, and then we could do some funky things around that. There are things you can do leveraging WAN acceleration devices. There's obviously different connections, ExpressRoute into Microsoft, and then there's some things you could do as well around quality of service, just to ensure that you're not going to be hogging bandwidth, and to make sure that you get the right levels of priority on your archive migration. So a number of things that you can think about. The key point out of this one for you is that, do you ship to disk and then send that way? Or do you go direct, and what can you expect? And we will spend a bit of time talking about speed in a little bit more detail as we move forward. The next thing to consider, 365 mailbox and message sizes. Those four examples there are the types of things that you need to consider. And those numbers are changing on a regular basis. The limits are always either changing or increasing in terms of what they look like. Good for you to know what that's about, to ensure that your data is going to be migrated in a supported fashion. The next one that we get asked an awful lot from customers is, do we do in-place hold, or do we do, now that we've got a journal, shall we use in-place hold? So I wanted to sort of explain to you what in-place hold is about, right? Some of you may know so. Let me just go through that. So it will provide you now a new method to store an immutable copy of a message in the mailbox. And those messages are then going to be kept there indefinitely. Now the thing is, though, there is no journal support. So enveloped messages, which are your journal messages, and the envelope contains things like BCC, distribution lists, etc. They're not supported by Microsoft in Office 365. However, those contents, etc., have been replaced with new message properties that can be enabled through the in-place hold. So when you think about having a journal yourself, if you need to have those envelope information available entirely. Again, that depends on how far your legal and compliance would like to go. And certainly if you have a journal, you're going to want to do discovery, so generally you'll want to know distribution list information, you'll want to know BCC information. That's where you would need to consider doing what we call a journal explosion. So that is basically converting or exploding the envelope so that the contents of the envelope get mapped to those fields that I mentioned that are available via in-place hold. So simply moving your journal directly into 365 doesn't necessarily give you everything from a discovery perspective. You need to consider whether a journal explosion is going to be something that is important to you. And there are tools out there that we work with that will deliver that type of capability for you. So whilst journal might seem simple, take it and put it to an in-place hold. That's something you need to think about. Obviously, then on that basis as well, given the 0.7 there about message sizes, etc., what's really important there is that a journal is going to be a large extraction. So often what will happen is the journal will need to go into multiple mailboxes. And let's talk about that as well in the context of departed users, the multiple mailbox concept. So when you have departed users, the thing you need to think about there is, firstly, do you have... If you've had a journal since day one of your implementation, then your departed user, and you are planning on migrating the journal, the contents of all of your departed users will be available in journal migration. So therefore, you do not at all to migrate your, with one exception. If you have delegated access to departed users, then that departed users archive needs to be migrated to its own licensed Office 365 account so that it can be then provisioned to the user if you'd like to do it that way. Or you may choose that you just want to extract the contents to a PST and import them into their mailbox. Regardless, something needs to be done with those particular delegated users. The thing as well is, perhaps what you might choose to do is just export your departed users into PST and keep them local and not bother transferring them. Some organisations like to do that from a belt and braces perspective, so that's something you can consider as well. The reality is, however, that there is no cost for the license of the archive mailbox. Whilst it's limited at 100 gig, that limit can be lifted. Microsoft have spoken about the unlimited archive mailbox. It's certainly been spoken about. Those limits can be lifted. So I would suggest to you that if you're migrating anyway, you might as well move your you might as well move them all there rather than move them to PST. And you can do that as well, by the way, with limited impact to your licensing. And this is also where it starts to become more compelling to do your archive as early on in the piece as possible. Because what you can do is, due to the way in-place hold works, you can effectively temporarily provision a mailbox in 365 for a departed user, migrate, place it on in-place hold, migrate the data, and then remove the license from the mailbox. Because it's on in-place hold, all that data is now going to stay there and is e-discoverable. By taking that approach, however, you can't then go and search that mailbox anymore. After 30 days, it's just going to become part of what's in place hold. So that's the departed users, and that's also as it related to the previous point that we were talking about here with the journal and in-place hold. Okay, number 10, existing shortcuts. This is a very, very important one for you, particularly if you are in an Enterprise Vault environment today and you have shortcuts. You will find that if you have done some test mail migrations of primary user mailboxes, that some of those shortcuts will have worked, and you think, oh, that's great, so we'll just leave it in Enterprise Vault where it is and we'll just leave the shortcuts there. That'll be great. You may have found, however, that for some users those shortcuts just didn't work. Or you may even have found that they used to work but then they stopped working and now there's no way for you to get them working again. So very important for you to note that there is no support for shortcuts in 365 if you are an Enterprise Vault organization. So the last thing you want to do is have those shortcuts migrated up to 365. The thing that's really important as well is that if you've got existing stubs, a lot of the archive platforms actually don't correctly store the location of the message in the mailbox. So that's where you get into the scenario of messages coming out not being able to be stored in the right folders when they make their way over to 365. So really important that you manage the process around your archive shortcuts. So one of the big questions there is, when's the best time to remove the shortcut from the mailbox? So if possible, it's always best to synchronize the location of the shortcut, migrate the archive to 365, delete the shortcut from the mailbox, and then start the synchronization of the live mailbox. So this way, once you cut over your mailbox to 365, the time to pre-stage your live mail is reduced because you won't have to have any stubs synchronized to 365, so there's less messages going. And the final cut over of the mailbox is much smaller because the scan before the cutover completes is shorter because it doesn't need to scan all of those stubs. So the upside of all of that is you can move a much larger group of users every evening than what you otherwise would be able to. So the impact of how you deal with platform shortcuts is an absolutely key consideration for you. All right, so we've now gone through the top 10, and I mentioned that I would come and talk to you about factors that affect speed. There's the obvious one that we've spoken about already, which is your bandwidth and your availability of that bandwidth, how heavily saturated the link is, etc. There are a number of other things that can absolutely affect the speed of your migration, particularly the health of the existing archive. If you happen to be running a very old archive platform that's been sitting there for a long time, it's not been actively archiving, but you're using it for e-discovery and you've got to keep it, and you want to move that, chances are that archive platform is going to have some holes in its data and it's going to potentially be slower to come out. If it's an old system, it's typically going to be on old hardware. It may be on old storage. It may be on a Centera platform, for example, which is generally slower to extract from, or a data domain platform, which is slower to extract from. It could be on slow storage. It could be anything around that infrastructure that the archive is sitting on, right? You can see how the health of the existing archive, if it's aged, drives a lot of potential infrastructure issues. So very important there. The other thing that affects speed is this whole idea around permissions, right? So it's common for organizations to take a phased approach to user migrations. And that's usually due to permissions associated with mailboxes and ensuring that users are moved at the same time when they've got access to some shared mailboxes or they need to be moved with their managers, etc. So sometimes the overall speed of your project can be hindered by that just by virtue of how your groupings might work out. And then, of course, there's all the organizational factors that come into play. Change control approvals, migration windows, business readiness, user communications, all of those items come in that actually will affect the duration of your project. Because generally when there's an archive migration, it's in sync with a live mail migration, and the project's not complete till the live mail migration is complete, so all of these factors compound. And again, as I was saying, because we think we can get to 365 quicker with the archive, and we do that transparent to the user, and it can run in an entirely background process and pre-sync the data. That's how you can then start to shorten the duration of your project, and by taking that approach so you can get ahead of the curve. Big question that often gets asked is, does speed matter? And yes, speed does matter, there's no question. However, in our experience, what we've seen is that your business generally won't move at the same pace as the migration of your mailboxes or archives due to some of those reasons that I've just gone there, particularly around the organizational stuff. And all those organizational points tend to make it that whilst when you're looking at doing this migration, you're very concerned about how long it's going to take, what you'll find is that generally the size of your archive and the number of archives you're moving is positively correlated with the amount of time it's going to take your organization to get going. So just by way of example, right, we're regularly using third-party tools at the moment, and we're migrating to 365 at upwards of 60 gigabytes an hour. So that's 4 times faster than Microsoft can state that you can move, right? So while speed's important when you're migrating your archive, there's typically so many other constraints that are going to prevent you from perhaps maximizing performance. And often what you'll find is that the archive migration will finish well ahead of your live mail migrations. So How do you choose a product? Where do you go when you choose a product? And on the screen there is a list of the companies that we work for, and for all of those, we work with them extensively in Asia Pac. We were Transvolt's Global International Partner of the Year and Quadratec's Global Partner of the Year last year. Do a lot of work with the organisations you see there. They are the tool sets that we work with. Indeed, there's also one missing there from another company as well. So numerous tool sets. Where do you go? What do you do? How do you make that choice? So I'd like to sort of bring you along with an analogy here. If you're moving house, right? So this is your house A, and let's say your house A is Enterprise Vault or one of these archives. That would be analogous with house A. And you're now going to move over into this lovely new house. Notice there's clouds in the background. That was as good as cloud as I could get. But your new house in the cloud, which realistically is Office 365. When you do that, you ring the removalist companies and you say, hey, I need to move contents of house A into house B, and I want you to come and quote me. So they come and they have a look and they ask you a bunch of questions and they give you a quote. At no point in that process, however, did you ask them what truck they were driving. You kind of would assume that because they're specialists in doing these types of removals and taking from A and giving to B, that they're going to choose the right truck for you. And similarly, if you're working with an organisation that does work with multiple tool sets, then they will be able to make the recommendation of what the most appropriate tool set is for you to use. And as far as you're concerned, if you're going to be delivered with an end-to-end service that can provide you all of your archives migrated without you having to worry about it yourselves, then at that point, it's just like moving house. You want someone to pick it up and move it and put it into the other side. Let your provider help work with you to choose the most cost-effective truck or the most cost-effective tool to get you to 365. Don't get hung up on features and benefits and pros and cons and speeds and feeds. Don't let that become an issue for you, because what you're really trying to do is key consideration number one, achieve your business outcome. If you're working with an organisation that can provide you that, then you shouldn't need to concern yourself with what tool they're using. You need to concern yourself more so with the user experience and the outcome that's going to come from it. So, in summary, first thing you need to do, decide on the automated versus manual. Cost up both options if you need to. If you don't have a compelling business requirement, that key consideration one, if you don't have that compelling business requirement to get your archive there at a certain speed, or you don't have any of those things we spoke about, cost both options and see which one's going to be better for you. Make yourself very aware of those top 10 considerations. Do make sure that you're asking those questions and asking yourselves those questions. And as I said just then, concern yourself less with the technology choice of how you're going to get there, more about what type of outcome can you expect. And then the other thing I'd like to leave you with as well is, make sure that the partner you're choosing to work with when you're delivering these services has the experience suitable to your specific requirements. So you want to know that they understand your source archive. Every archive is different. Every archive has different quirks and twiddles that you need to be thinking about. That's what keeps a team of sort of 7 individuals in my business busy all day, every day, is working with those different archives. So really important that you choose an organisation that's got a good, strong track record that because ultimately, this data that you're moving, if you need to get it there and you need to get it there safely, securely, in a legally defensible manner, then you want to know how it's going to get there and what you're going to do. This stuff is complex. I can tell you that without any shyness. An archive migration is not necessarily a straightforward migration. Hopefully with some of the considerations I've shown you today that you need to think about, you can see just some of those complexities. That said, you can deliver an outstanding user experience if you've got the right skills involved in doing this. I do not recommend people to attempt this themselves. In certain circumstances, there are things you could do yourself, but ultimately what you'll find is if you take it as an end-to-end service, you just don't have to think about it and you can concentrate on other stuff that probably matters more to you. So it can be made simple, but they are a complex beast. So that's my 12 slides. Did it in just under 40 minutes. So potentially you're going to get some time back in your day. Let me open it up, Amy, if I throw it back to you, and you can let us know if you've had any questions coming in through the process.
Okay, thanks, Ronnie. So if you do have any questions, if you just pop those in the questions box, which is just at the right-hand side of your screen, I'll read those out for Ronnie shortly.
And while you're putting in any questions, we have on the phone with us Simon. Simon runs the archive migration practice here at Incentra. Amy, I just want to make sure that we can hear Simon, because I'm sure some of these questions are going to get technical and little old me's going to get in trouble. So Simon might need to take them. Simon, can we hear you?
I think he's unmuted. Simon, there.
Can you hear me?
Excellent. All right, so now everybody can hear the guy that really knows everything about archives and archive migration. So throw some curly ones at him.
Okay. So I have a question here from Paul, who's asked if, who said, can the existing archive platform shortcuts be explained more? I understand that you move the archive, but when it was explained you delete the shortcuts, how does the unarchive email replace the shortcut? Is there an import from the archive email into the mailbox that means the unarchived email replaces the shortcuts which were deleted?
Yeah. You may have struggled to understand that question, but you know the scary thing is both Simon and I think, understood that. Simon, you want to take that one?
Yeah, no problem. So I guess the best way to look at it is we're not replacing the existing shortcut. What we're going to do is two separate processes. One process is to go and work out where the shortcut is, what its location is inside the mailbox, and then work out what item inside the archive it corresponds to. And then in the second process, we're going to go and actually find that item in the archive and move it into the mailbox. And then we can come back at any point and delete that original shortcut. We're not actually manipulating the shortcut or the stub and recreating the message body. We're putting a whole new item back into the mailbox and then removing that stub.
Okay, thanks guys. So another question here, so this is from Thomas, who said, we have a really small organisation, around 10 or so users. Will it be as complex and time consuming as you have mentioned?
No, when you're at a 10 user organisation, quite surprising. If you did have an archive, I suspect you've got an archive then because you've got some legal requirements. Generally, we don't see archives in organisations either unless they've got specific requirements like that, or if they have larger environments. So the short answer is for 10 users, we would absolutely recommend manual unless you have some legal requirement that requires all sorts of chain of custody, etc. And it wouldn't be complex at all, but still you'd have to consider things.
Thanks, Ronnie. So I have a question here from James, who's asked, is it possible to migrate with zero impact on the user?
I'll give you that one.
In the majority of situations, yes, there are specific scenarios where we're unable to do that, and Ronnie alluded to a few of them earlier. And that's largely to do with the current version of Exchange or the process that you're taking to move your primary mailbox. But a well-planned migration should result in next to no impact on user experience. And arguably, if we've done our job correctly or your solution provider has done their job correctly, the user will just come in the next day and everything will be the same as it was the day before.
Okay, thank you. So we have another question here. This is from Phil, who said, we have an enterprise vault environment that is read-only. Can we copy it to Azure and migrate from there, and will it be faster?
Absolutely. Yes, no worries. Absolutely, that's something that can be done, and yes, it will be significantly faster. One of the nice advantages of moving your data to Azure is you can take advantage of some of the backlinks that exist between Azure and 365, and the restrictions around throttling are much lighter. So yes, it's doable, and yes, it's much faster.
Okay, thank you. So if we should wait a couple more minutes, just see if we have any more questions. Okay, so I think that's it for the day for the questions. So thanks, Ronnie, and everyone for presenting the webinar today, and thank you everyone for joining us and taking the time out of your busy schedules to watch the webinar. So as mentioned previously, I'll send you all a link this afternoon with the recording for you to watch if you'd like to rewatch it. And if you could also fill out the feedback form at the end, we'd really appreciate that. Okay, so thanks everyone and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.